So Huntsman Security, you have fairly recently launched SmartCheck for ransomware. So we're all aware of ransomware as a problem, but what is the, I guess, what does the product do to address the situation that many people are facing?
Yeah, well, you're quite right. I mean, ransomware is it's been a huge challenge. I mean, going back a few years, but certainly in the last two. And really, there's a couple of dimensions to it that led to the product we launched. One is that ransomware attacks, for all the hype about how sophisticated machine intelligence and artificial intelligence, machine learning, and network activity tracking is useful to detect sophisticated attacks, and that's certainly true. A lot of the attacks that we've seen have been caused by, or allowed rather, by reasonably simple flaws in existing security controls. So you've got situations where ransomware has been allowed into organizations by unsecured remote access points that have got a single username rather than multi-factor authentication, or by a patch that's been missing, or if you look back to WannaCry and the NHS, by using unsupported software. So the best defenses against ransomware, and if you look at NCSC here in the UK or ACSC in Australia, or the NIST guidance, they tend to be what you'd call the basic cyber hygiene security controls, like patching, like having controls on admin accounts, controlling what applications people can execute. And this has been brought out again and again. So what we produced was a solution that essentially checks, audits, assesses, reviews the configuration, the deployment, the coverage, the rollout of those cyber hygiene controls, and allows you to generate an easy report on it, so that you can find your weaknesses, your vulnerabilities, your issues within your control environment, but also so you've got the ability to demonstrate or prove that or show that to other stakeholders. So there's that aspect to it. But the second stream is that, of course, we're not the only people to have noticed this. Senior business stakeholders have noticed this, and particularly cyber insurers have noticed this. So what you're also now seeing is not only organizations having to have controls in place to defend against ransomware, they're also having to be able to demonstrate and prove and evidence those controls to third parties, whether it's in a supply chain arrangement or if it's a cyber insurer who is asking you for details of the controls you've got in place and how they're working. You need to be able to provide them a quick, easy report, fill in a questionnaire, give them evidence that the controls are there, either pre or post breach. So you've also got that need for visibility and oversight of that control environment too, because the worst thing is to assume that you're patching all your applications and operating systems, only to find that you haven't been when you get hit by an attack. So it's a solution that gives you the ability to monitor, to assess your control environment and demonstrate that report on it in an easy and effective way.
Okay, and in terms of the way it does that, am I right in thinking you're using the sort of, I won't call it industry standard, but fairly well respected prevention, containment, recovery model? Is that correct?
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, the thing that's interesting, I think, about ransomware, and again, we're not unique in this. I mean, certainly the Australian Essential 8 standard follows that sort of model. If you look at the guidance on mitigating ransomware from NCSC, they've got a very similar approach to how to think about the ransomware threat. And the reason for that is the ransomware, the initial intrusion will typically be via an access point, or via a download, or via a phishing email, or a drive-by, a website that somebody is lured to. So the method of initial intrusion is not limited, but there are a number of ways that the patient zero, if you like, is infected. But then the way that initial infection on say your workstation or mine spreads around our network is different. It doesn't then send phishing emails to 1,000 other people in the same organization. It spreads from system to system, exploiting operating system vulnerabilities. It escalates privilege, lateral movement. So the two techniques are very different. So the prevention stage, the containment stage, are different controls. But obviously, you're trying to stop ransomware getting onto as many systems as possible. And clearly, then if you do get hit by ransomware, if it does subvert one of your users, if it does manage to spread to some servers that haven't been patched, or whatever ends up happening, The recovery process is really one of handling the incident response, and secondly, of course, with ransomware, oh my God, please have backups, because even if you pay the ransom and get the encryption key, as Colonial found, it may well be the case that you cannot actually get your systems back up and running, even given that. So backups are really critical. So you've got that phased approach to, thinking about the kill chain, if you like, for a ransomware attack.
In terms of folks that have been using it, because I think the product's been out since the sort of back end of last year, clearly there'll be a whole range of discoveries from, we're absolutely perfect, which is perhaps unlikely, but there are probably one or two companies that are pretty good, and a lot maybe not. But in general, has the feedback been, wow, we didn't realize we had quite so many vulnerabilities, or what's the sort of overall feedback been?
Yeah, well, there's been a couple of interesting points, I think. I mean, one of the main themes that's come out again and again, if you ask me for, the one takeaway, it will be that the people's perception of how their controls are operating, how effective they are, can be very different to the reality. And that can be uncomfortable. A couple of customers we've had, they were fairly sure that they were quite good at patching. They were covering most of their systems most of the time. When they actually looked to find what operating system versions, what patches, what application patches were out there, they found that the level of coverage was way down from what they thought. And the reason for that, in a couple of cases, is simply that when you commission a traditional audit, a manual audit, you tend to sample the environment. So you pick a set of systems to look at, and of course, which ones are you going to go and look at? Well, let's look at all the ones in the data center, because that's convenient and handy and nearby and in the basement. Or you pick the ones that if you're, I won't say being mendacious, but you pick the ones that are hopefully representative of what you aspire to. So, the servers that and manage, and you forget the development environment, or you forget the legacy systems, and so sampling bias can play an effect. But certainly there've been a couple of cases where people have found that their level of coverage has been a lot lower, and level of effectiveness has been a lot lower than they thought, and that's led to, as you say, perhaps some oh my God moments. Also, I think possibly some discussions verging on arguments, where the actual data from the solution that has provided the evidence for the lower score has been very different to the manual audit. But then the other side of it, I think, is that for organizations that are reasonably well managed, we've just had the solution deployed in a council here in the UK, and their environment was actually, from what I've heard, sort of smoke signals, but from the people that have been involved, has been that their environment's pretty tight. It's quite well managed. Yet, what they did find was an old Windows 7 box sitting out there on the network, that people sort of knew about but was kind of forgotten about. But it was flagged up as being, something that wasn't, running latest versions of Windows, wasn't supported. So, whilst most of their environment was fine, they did find that needle in a haystack, which actually, they can do something about now, and it sort of surfaced it as a problem. So yeah, there's a range of issues, but certainly I don't think we've ever run it or had it used by anybody, and they've come back and said, oh yeah, that's exactly as we expected. There's always a perception reality gap, I think, in security across the board. I mean, I think for the last 30 years, I think we've been seeing this.
And in terms of the GAS, I mean, you've alluded to a couple of times patch management issues and sort of ID access control. Are those the two main things? Or are there any other things that you've sort of come across that as maybe more prevalent than others? Yeah,
certainly patch management is a big problem for all organizations. You start with operating systems, but then you've got to work down into applications. The other things that we've observed are, you do have situations where there are policies set up for things like application execution control in the Windows environment, and those policies are tight or loose, but that you might think because you're using application execution control you're protected, but of course you're only protected to how as well as you've configured it. So if you limit applications, but you're allowing scripts, or you're allowing DLLs, then there's still weakness there. But the other challenge, of course, is that you set the policy up, you apply it to your environment, and then a shipment of new servers or a set of new systems arrive in the cloud for a particular project or a particular new business line. And those systems are not brought under the management umbrella. So some of the patching issues, in fact, were similar, where the endpoints that were affected had just not been registered with the patching servers that the organization used. So they had a patching system, they had a patch management, used Microsoft SCCM, but they hadn't registered a set of endpoints with it. So those endpoints weren't being patched, but they weren't also reporting on their patch status. And the other one is around controls on administrator accounts, because there's a lot you can do by limiting, of course, who has access to admin accounts and how long they get access to, but also the privileges that those accounts actually have. But when you look at ransomware, the challenge, what you don't want is an admin account which can receive emails, because then the administrator in their administrative capacity can receive phishing emails the same as you or I can. And you don't really want admin accounts that can go out to the internet and browse websites with domain admin privileges on the endpoints that you're that the user's using. So there are certainly policy configuration things that you can find, either coverage or quality, that are not that are not providing an effective deterrence. And as I say, the challenge of ransomware is you only need one user to fall for one phishing email and have one vulnerable system, and then that initial intrusion happens, and then it spreads, and that's really where the problem starts. So,
and in terms of the actual the SmartCheck for ransomware, the reports you produce, I believe there are 3 levels. So there's a sort of high level, board level, giving those folks the sort of flavour of what's going on. A more sort of hardcore one for the IT people, so they can see the actual sort of technical issues maybe. And then you also produce a sort of to-do remediation list. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think ransomware is, I mean, cybersecurity to a point, but certainly ransomware has been a challenge that businesses outside of security and IT and risk have become aware of, because obviously, if you've suddenly got to find $10 million worth of Bitcoin, that tends to mobilize an organization, certainly at the top level. So yeah, so the challenge in security has always been, how do we report on security? You get those sort of issues around, you've got no incidents, and then you start looking for incidents. You buy a SIEM or an IDS system, and then suddenly you've spent money, but you've got more reports. So security KPIs, security metrics have always been tough. So what we do at the top level, we provide an overall score, percentage achieved, if you like, protection score. We also break that down in the dashboard into those 3 phases that you mentioned, into how the prevention controls, the containment controls, recovery controls are rating, and then obviously for each individual control element, there's a score for how good patching is, how good admin accounts are configured, how good backups are, those kind of things. So at the top level, you've got KPIs, you've got metrics that the board, the stakeholders, insurers, customers can use to judge, what level of protection you're providing your systems. And then, of course, the level below that, I guess, is the detail of how that is broken down in terms of individual controls, whether it's policy issues, whether it's policy configuration, policy coverage, whether it's systems that are missing patches or patch management systems that are missing systems. But of course, as you rightly say, down at the bottom end, the IT admin guys, the things that you need to feed into your IT operations workflows to get addressed. This system is running Windows 7. It needs to be upgraded to, something newer. That's obviously a low level thing, because then you're talking about, what is the IP address, the host name, where is it? So then you have the underlying detail. So it's the systems that are affected by a particular issue, or the policies that are containing a certain weakness, or the user accounts that are configured badly. So then at the bottom end, you do get that sort of, and you can click through. It works exactly like a web page would. You click on a number 3, which is affected servers, and you get a list of the 3 affected servers. So yes, you can then get down to the things that you need your IT ops team to go out and remediate and fix. So yeah, at the low end, yeah, it's host names of systems that are not being patched, or user accounts that need reconfiguring, definitely. And
in terms of the sort of feedback, we've already covered the fact that most people, virtually everyone using it, it did uncover security issues. But I'm also wondering, has there been any sort of resistance? I think you mentioned, it's created the odd argument, but I'm just wondering, if the security department feels a little bit, sort of insecure when someone says, right, we're going to run this and find out all the problems, when they're fairly confident maybe that there aren't any. And who champions it? I say, do the security department sort of audit themselves, or is it someone higher up says, look, we need to do this? I guess trying to understand that, you know, that conversation and whether there's any pushback against this kind of activity initially, how it works.
Yeah, well, I mean, speaking personally, I think that's actually its biggest strength, because the challenge with security audits, assessments, reviews in the past has been one of, I mean, the resistance you mentioned, I think is, I mean, I've spent time as a consultant doing this kind of work, and yeah, you certainly do find sometimes that, you know, the last thing people want is the auditors coming around. So you've got a slight issue in that if you're allowing your security operations function or your IT operations function to report on the security controls that it manages, it's difficult sometimes for other stakeholder groups, whether it's the risk committee or whether it's an insurer or a third party, to take that as gospel when it's come from the people that are running the system. So you've got that, you know, is it objective? You know, is this a fair assessment of the state of security? But the other side of the fence is that when an audit, either external or internal, or by a third party or by an insurer, is commissioned, then from the people that work in security, the people that work in IT operations, you've got that awful process where, oh God, the auditors are coming in next week. You know, that's going to be fun, sort of thing. So you do have that kind of resistance on both ends. There's a resistance to trust information that comes from the security delivery function, but also when the security delivery function is being audited, it can be quite an unpleasant process for them. And in some situations, of course, if they're being continuously audited, you know, this week it's one supplier, next week it's their insurer, the week after that it's internal audit, the week after that it's security managers. You can get that situation of audit fatigue where you're constantly being audited, and whatever you tell them, they don't believe. However, what we've now got in this solution is something which it works as a self-contained tool. So it can be run by the security function itself, by the IT operations function. They can use it to generate their own reports, their own stats, their own dashboards, their own information around how their controls are performing so they can improve. It can also be executed or run by the audit function, or by a consultant who's come in to do a review of the organization. You know, they can run the same tool, get the same data from the same systems, get the same results. So actually it democratizes security reporting in the way that the tool allows the people being audited to generate their own audits and provide their own trustworthy data, but also to know what it is the external auditors or the or internal audits or the consultants are going to find when they come and do their review. So in theory, there's no surprises there, and the way the solution works, just mechanically, it allows the person running the data collection, if you like, to export that data set and send it to a central hub or send it to the recipient. They can then load it in the same tool to generate whatever cut of data they want for their particular report. So you can even have a model where if you had, say, 10 business units, they could each have a copy, use it for their own reporting, but then they can gather the data collected, send it back to the central point of security assurance, the risk team. So, and they can load the data set in the evidence file, if you like, and generate local reports, either for each business unit or across the piece. So what it does give the ability to do, I think, is to gather that kind of audit information in a more trustworthy, slightly more more flexible, more friendly way by anybody. And because the solution does what the solution does, people can trust it, because it's, if you run the tool and I run the tool, we're going to get the same data from the same systems. It's not going to vary between, it's not going to make assumptions that you or I would make as humans. It's just providing the data in report form. So I think it solves that problem, actually, of audit fatigue, of being audited, of trusting the data that comes from the operations function.
And in terms, I guess as well, one of the benefits, as you say, getting some out, external auditors in and stuff, disruptive, time-consuming, expensive, maybe. This way you can do it on an automated basis, but also you can run it, I guess, frequent. I mean, is there a recommended frequency that you run these audits? You clearly don't want to do it necessarily every day, but is it weekly, monthly, or do different organizations have different levels of sort of implementation?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. I mean, I suppose the other side of this is that when you do have an audit, and the auditor says, "Can I see your evidence of patching? Can I see your list of systems? Can I see your admin accounts?" one of the challenges is going off and getting that data from 10 different systems each time. So, even when that external audit does occur, you can provide a data set or a set of outputs, or you can provide the data set the tool has collected and said, right, here you are, here is the information, go and look at it however much you want. And it streamlines that sort of data acquisition process, I think, even in a traditional audit environment. But the interesting thing, of course, is that, yeah, you're quite right. One of the challenges of the traditional audit process, if you like, is that it was fairly infrequent. It might have been annual, and obviously things move pretty fast in technology and security. So an annual review of how up to date you are on patching is not really going to tell you how good your patching is the rest of the year. And you'd have the audit, you'd get findings, you'd fix the findings in most cases, hopefully, and then you might do a re-audit in, say, 6 weeks or 2 months, or you might wait until the next annual audit to see what shows at that time. So it's a very slow, very low cadence process. The advantage of having a tool that does this for you, that you can use very easily and gather the data without the manual intervention, is that you can move from an annual audit process, and you probably will still have an external annual audit, that will still happen. It just might be streamlining the data provision, but you can up your cadence. So instead of doing the annual audit and checking it every July, you can run the solution every month and see how you're performing month to month to month, and then spot trends more easily. But you can also, increase it even more. You could look at a particular control on a weekly basis if you were running a particular security improvement plan around rolling out new versions of operating systems, new patches, new configurations. So, you could even be reporting on the progress this week compared to last week. It's not something which costs money to run more often. Whereas with an audit, you spend 20, 100, whatever it is on the audit process. Then you're going to have a re-audit, so that's going to be a little bit less. But you can't do that every 5 minutes because you're paying money out. Whereas with a solution, of course, you can run it on a Monday, make changes on a Tuesday, run it again on a Wednesday to see if those changes have improved the scores. And that does mean that you've got a much faster, much more responsive security reporting process around how controls work. And if you're improving security, if you're measuring the effectiveness of a security improvement program, then of course that regular reporting is very useful. You don't start, do the work and then finish and check it. You can increment and report on it through the way. So even as a project management tool within security improvement programs, I think it has value.
And in terms of the way it's being offered to customers, I believe you're going through the channel. And is it a product that an end user can buy, install, if you like, and run themselves, or is it an as a service that the channel offers to its customers, or is it, how does it get to market?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly from our point of view, I mean, it's a product, and yes, to answer the question, there's no reason why a reasonably technically savvy person with the right the right credentials and knowledge of the systems in place can install it and get it running quite easily. I mean, I think as with most software packages, there's always some things that are, I think, useful to know the first time you run through things. But yeah, you install it, it connects into security management systems you've got, like SCCM, Active Directory. So you need account credentials and API keys for some of these things. But yeah, then it gathers the data and shows you reports. And I think most IT admins, most security operations people, and actually quite a long way up the management stack, actually, way beyond where people have got the technical knowledge to go and delve into Active Directory and understand groups and memberships and permissions and policy settings. It's a very usable tool from that point of view. In terms of how it's sold through a channel type model, I mean, there's quite a lot of different ways that could work. So, I mean, if I just pick consultants as one sort of route to market, it could be the case where a consultant buys a copy of the tool and uses it themselves to carry out reviews. It could be a case where the consultant, if they're doing like a virtual CISO type thing, which has got a few days a month and a monthly reporting type output, it could be that they bought the solution as or the customer buys the solution as part of that overall service wrapper. It could be the consultant persuades the customer they need a solution for security reporting. The customer buys it, and actually the consultant is one of the users within that customer environment who uses it to generate reports alongside customer team as well, depending on the engagement. And then from the point of view, I suppose, the reseller end of things, reseller and distributor. I mean, it's a software solution that somebody can buy and deploy and use, and so it could be something where there's actually quite a hands-off channel, but it's then used by the admin team, the security operation team, the internal audit team within that customer organization, and they just use it and run it. And there's been a traditional channel relationship through distributors and VARs between us, the supplier, and the end customer. So it's pretty flexible from that point of view. I mean, certainly, talking to consultants, and there's been quite a lot of interest from consultants, because everybody needs ways to carry out, more work and more reviews and deliver more value without just, ramping up the headcounts quite so much. So, different consultants have got different ideas about how they would use it given their sort of engagement model. So, yeah, it's pretty flexible from that point of view. I think, that there'll be ways of using it, ways of selling it, ways of incorporating it into service wrappers that we haven't yet come across. And I'd encourage anybody that's got ideas about how they might want to think about assessing ransomware risk to get in touch, because if they've got a way of working that they want to stick with or they want to adopt, then there's probably a way of doing it. I would think it's more than happy to have a discussion around that.
Okay, and then maybe looking ahead, I mean, obviously ransomware is what we're talking about today, but in terms of your organization and plans, clearly you're not going to sort of reveal the company secrets, but what's on the roadmap for 2022 and beyond that in terms of what you're looking at?
Yeah, well, the other side of our business is around security analytics and SIEM, and so we provide solutions that are monitoring controls rather than assessing, and monitoring activity rather than checking to see whether it's compliant. So the other Huntsman angle, of course, is that operational monitoring SIEM, SOAR capability to respond to threats when they occur, and looking at things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework for heat mapping threats and alerts as they happen across the process of an attack. So what we have got, I think, is the ability to think about the risks we identify given that operational knowledge as well. So there's a few ways in which we can start to join these things together. So, for instance, if you know a set of users or groups or systems is vulnerable in some way, you can feed that into your security operations function, and then you can start to pay particular attention to alerts that come from those systems. Coupled with that, of course, you can also combine the information you receive from logs and firewalls and things, and feed that into the risk decisions you're making when you identify patches that are missing, for instance. But the other thing I think that is quite interesting is when you start to look at how you quantify risk, and there's a lot of interest in risk quantification just in general, but also when you start looking at financial risk. So you might have a situation, for instance, where you identify two different systems that have got missing patches or bad configurations in some way. Which one do you fix first? Well, it might be that the organization knows that this server is more important than that server, but sometimes programmatically you can deduce that. So possibly by looking at the configuration of the system itself, by looking at how busy it is, but also you can start to understand the criticality of systems based on usage patterns and that kind of operational data too. So risk quantification is an interesting one, I think. Saying that a system's got a missing patch in the context of what that system actually does, that is quite interesting. And then the other side of it is feeding into automation. And automation is not for all organizations, but if you were to imagine a situation where you've got 10 systems that have got missed patches, or you've got 3 failed backups, or you've got some user accounts that need to be corrected, there's a couple of things that we can do. And we've got the capability now, but I think is the market ready for these kind of more advanced solutions where you can start to think about, what happens next? You generate a report, you present the information, but how does that get addressed? And there's a few ways that could work. It could be that you automatically create tickets in a ticketing system, say, well, there's a few on the market, but so you use the solution to actually raise the tickets on your behalf. So you can press a button that says, please mark these 3 servers to be fixed, and a ticket gets created in the IT operations workflow. You could have a situation where the email is sent to the user accounts or the admins to make changes to the group memberships, etc. But also, you've got that ability to say, well, if we're querying Active Directory to retrieve information about group memberships and policies and things, and we identify some issues, can we query Active Directory to fix those issues? And I think, that's certainly technically feasible. So, you identify a change that's needed to your application control policy, for instance. Could we just make that change if somebody wanted that change made? And the answer is, of course, technically yes. But I think we've got to be quite cautious about providing solutions like that, not because the technology isn't necessarily trustworthy, but because of the roles and responsibilities of the people using it. You might want a consultant to review your environment, but you don't necessarily want them to have the ability to go off and make changes to it. And likewise, you don't want a head of internal audit saying, oh yeah, well, let's just apply all these patches, if they then apply patches to systems that that can't be patched for whatever reason, because the application that they run needs a certain version of operating system, because then you start to make changes that are damaging. And in that situation, feeding something into a ServiceNow workflow is probably better. So there's certainly a lot we can do in terms of tying in with risk and understanding risk better, but also in terms of the workflows downstream from the solution. How much of those do organizations want us to support? And I think we'll get feedback from customers over time on that, because knowing whether you want to be able to send an email or raise a ticket or actually make a change, there's the code is the code in each case is not complicated, but it's the process that you wrap around that, I think.
Okay, and maybe just perhaps a little unfair, this question, because cybersecurity is such a massive issue and there's so many parts to it. But if I guess most companies are aware that they need to do things with it, are there one or two pieces of advice you'd give to people? Just I mean, it amazes me. I can't remember how many at the last count, but there are potentially over 100 different categories of cybersecurity products, whatever. I mean, are there some easy wins or an approach that brings sort of quicker dividends than others? Just in terms of we've got this cybersecurity issue, we know about ransomware, etc. Where do we start? Is that possible to answer?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I probably alluded to this earlier on, but yeah, I mean, ransomware is very useful to security teams for two reasons. One is a lot of the ways of defending yourself from ransomware attacks are those cyber hygiene, those basic foundational controls. And I think, we've been banging on for years in security about patch your systems, about configure admin accounts securely, about limit what people can do on systems. And actually, those are the ways that ransomware attacks happen. So having the ability to lift your operational baseline to the point where those core security deliverables, those core baseline controls are working and are effective is key. And ransomware is a good enough reason, as much as any of the other ones have been, to get those fixed and get those in place. And of course, the beauty of that in some ways is that they're not always, I mean, not to trivialize, but they're not expensive in terms of having to buy things in order to get some of these things, installed and working. But what you do need, of course, if you're focusing on those controls, is the ability to report on them and provide KPIs that align to what you're trying to achieve. So there's no good, spending 3 months doing patching if you don't really have a KPI around patching performance. That 3 months effort has, it's nice, but nobody sees it. So having the ability to lift your operational baseline and report on that is one thing. But the other useful thing I think about ransomware is that the financial side of it is compelling, because in the past, of course, organizations could assume if they had a breach that it wouldn't be a bad one, that it wouldn't cost too much, they could manage it internally. They might trust to luck a bit more than perhaps they ought to. And ransomware, of course, has very clear, very visible, very expensive impacts. You've got to find $10 million if that is the ransom you've got to pay, or you've got to find backups, which you hopefully have got. And until you do that, you can't serve your customers. So you've got a very clear link between what the business is trying to achieve, which is to operate normally, and the impacts of a breach, and a much clearer link than I think in ransomware than in any other kind of thing. So you can use ransomware as a case for making improvements. And I guess the other piece of advice is, you are going to get audited. You are going to be asked to demonstrate your security performance. You are going to need to report on KPIs, whether it's your board, your internal audit committee, your customers. Customers are increasingly aware of supply chain issues, and ransomware can be disruptive in ways that past types of breaches weren't. And the other angle, of course, is your insurer. If you have cyber insurance, they will be asking you what controls you've got in place, how good those controls are, how well managed. And they will ask you when you take a policy out. And if you answer, if you've chosen poorly, then your premium will be high. And it may even be that you can't get insurance because you haven't got sufficient controls in place. So having those controls and be able to report on them in a trustworthy way might be the difference between having insurance or not, or having a premium you can afford or not. And then when you make a claim, having a claim that the insurance company will actually settle or not. So the financial business case, if you like, for doing security right has never been stronger. And that's a useful thing, I think, for anybody who is wanting to reduce their level of risk.
Okay, well, it's been really, really great to chat to you today. So, Piers, thank you
you
very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
No problem at all. It's been great to talk.